Thank you. Welcome back. I have the honor of introducing Michelle Makori. She is an internationally acclaimed broadcast journalist, news anchor, reporter, and producer. She's the lead anchor and editor-in-chief at Kitco News. And if you were here yesterday before her fireside chat, we got news that her organization won an annual award, which is Crypto Media Channel of the Year from a conference in Malta, which was neat. So at Kitco, she manages the editorial team covering global financial and business news across the spectrum of cryptocurrencies, commodities, equity markets, macroeconomics, and geopolitics. Michelle also hosts On the Spot with Michelle Makori, and you may have seen her prior to Kitco News on Bloomberg, CNN Money, I-24 News, and SABC. She's covered and analyzed the biggest global economic, financial, and geopolitical events in the past 2 decades and interviewed heads of state, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and other political, business, and entertainment leaders. She's going to start us off today with a panel discussion, so please welcome Michelle Makori.
Thank you. Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm going to let you sort that out while I give a brief introduction. Future of Finance, that is our panel this morning. Now, as a reminder, 14 years ago, we didn't know what a Bitcoin was, what a blockchain was, and now practically everybody knows what a Bitcoin is. The crypto market cap is just under $1 trillion. We've got over 21,000 coins and at least a dozen protocols. In 2008, when Satoshi was writing his white paper, I'll remind you that we were all writing checks. I haven't written a check in I don't even know how long. Our smartphones weren't that smart. I recall I was using a BlackBerry, but I certainly wasn't being able to use it as a payment tool. I didn't have Apple Pay, I didn't have Venmo, I didn't have Zelle. Just painting you a picture of how far we've come in just 14 years. It can be a significant amount of time when it comes to technological change, particularly as it has been in the world of finance. So what can we expect in the future? Well, we're going to prognosticate with our 2 panelists today. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Chris Tyrell. He has been a finance, fintech, and crypto leader for over 15 years. He currently serves as senior advisor at blockchain.com, advising on America's compliance and global sanctions issues. He joined blockchain.com from Goldman Sachs, where he was head of digital assets compliance, and he joined Goldman Sachs from Offerboard.com, an industry-leading platform for small business capital formation that was very successfully sold to a boutique investment bank in 2017. Now, while he was the CEO of Offerboard, Chris also served as chairman of the National Trade Association for Securities Crowdfunding, also known as CFRA, I believe, CFIRA. And Chris serves on a number of boards. Again, these are the abridged bios, because we'd be here all morning if I listed the accolades of our very esteemed panelists. He serves on the board of trustees of Lumen Gentium Academy. That's a classic Catholic high school. And he is, in fact, back in school. He's currently completing a master's degree at Oxford University. I stress this because I have no idea how the man has time to do all of this, especially considering that him and his wife, Susan, are raising 9 children. So, I mean, yeah. So when I say I don't have time to do anything, yeah, I mean, I guess we just have to look to Chris for time management. Maybe that should be a real topic for another panel sometime. Okay, also joining us is Patrick Campos. He's been in the blockchain space for over 5 years, serving as Chief Strategy Officer for Securrency. That's a blockchain-based financial markets infrastructure and products company that stands at the intersection of institutional finance and decentralized finance. And Patrick joins us all the way from Dubai, which, as we all know, is one of the crypto capitals of the world. Over the course of his professional career, Patrick has been a serial entrepreneur, a big firm lawyer, and an officer in the United States Marine Corps. Thank you for serving, Patrick. And Patrick is most proud of his role as a husband and father of 2, as well as 12 years as a catechist in the parish of St. Francis Jebel Ali in the United Arab Emirates. So, very experienced and esteemed panelists. We are unfortunately missing our third, but we can certainly make 2 of these fantastic guys, so let's get started. All right, when we say the future of finance, that is a very broad and all-encompassing term. So we're going to break it down into 3 timelines: near term, midterm, and long term. Chris, we'll start with you.
Yes.
I mean, right now, the sentiment from the naysayers, this is it. This is the end. We warned you, the Bitcoin bubble has burst. We warned you of over-leveraging. This is all a scam. This is how it all comes crashing down. They're trying to put the nail in the coffin of crypto. Now, I suspect you strongly disagree, and I know you do. So give us a picture of where you see the crypto and DeFi industry in the next 18 to 24 months.
Yeah, so the first thing I'd like to say about what I'll refer to as the recent unpleasantness is that the recent unpleasantness is caused by bad actors who created bad systems for managing their own companies and their own engagement in the industry. And my view on the next 18 to 24 months is shaped significantly by the number of good actors and big institutions that are getting involved in crypto, that are getting involved in the markets, that are building infrastructure, and that are really doing what you would do if you were investing in something for the long term. You're trying to find talent, you're hiring people, you're testing things, you're building proofs of concept. And the fact that Goldman Sachs, where I used to work, is doing that, Bank of New York Mellon is building things, State Street is building things, Fidelity spun out a whole digital assets division. These larger institutions are figuring out how to engage with crypto and are going to continue to engage with crypto. So I'm confident that over the next 18 to 24 months, things won't be certain and things will be rocky due to what we just went through, but that at the tail end of that, as we head towards a medium-term horizon of, say, 8 to 10 years, things are going to start significantly improving, and you'll see more and more institutional-grade activity in the space.
All right, but before we get to 8 to 10 years, give me a little bit more specificity of where you see us in 2 years' time, in the sense of, as I say, Bitcoin is between 16,500 and 17,000 at the moment, keeping in mind that that is 75% of its all-time high of around just under 69,000, which just happened to hit about a year ago, in fact. 2 years' time, do you see, and I use the Bitcoin price as a barometer for general sentiment in the market. Where do you see it in 2 years' time?
Sentiment will have improved. Where the price will end up 2 to 3 years from now, if I could tell you right now, I would just go make a lot of money betting on where it would be 2 to 3 years from now. But I generally think that over the next 2 to 3 years, many of the problems that are being unearthed by what just happened, by the recent unpleasantness, many of the problems that have been unearthed by that will have been solved and corrected, and confidence will begin to be restored. And as that confidence is restored, I believe generally prices will rise, and as people come back into the market.
All right, well, Patrick, one of the potential upsides of this debacle is that it can serve to purge some of the bad actors, some of the less relevant projects and cryptocurrencies. Where do you see the crypto and DeFi industry in the next 2 years?
Yeah, so, I come at it from a slightly different angle because, we're really focused on blockchain infrastructure and actually working with the institutional players, many of whom you referred to a moment ago. But having said that, what I see happening right now is actually a hardening, just in the wake of this recent unpleasantness, just a hardening of two very, very different positions, right? So on the one hand, I think that you'll find the traditional, TradFi players, and in particular the large custodians, who will say, yep, this is proof that we need, the old stalwarts in the game with tried and true risk management, big balance sheet, all of that. On the other hand, you're hearing a lot of people saying, no way, no custodial exchanges, hold your own keys, pushing in the opposite direction. You'll hear on the TradFi side, again, this is just proof of why we need these time-tested and regulated risk management methodologies. On the other hand, you're going to hear people say, no, DeFi takes that intermediary out of the equation and creates this trustless environment. And again, that's where it started. It's just beginning to harden and harden and harden. And you know, look, I go back a couple of years. You know, just as you know, say, you know, Steve Mnuchin and the Trump administration was exiting, and the new administration was coming in, and I said, my prediction is, in the near term, crypto is going to get trapped in an institutional garden, and then eventually it'll find its way back out. I think we're at that moment now. I kind of feel like we're kind of in that moment, and that's why it's going to be really important to maintain, you know, both sides and all those voices in the conversation. You know, to make sure that the promise of it, you know, continues to be fulfilled.
Patrick, I'm going to focus on your legal background here, because obviously the FTX debacle and the collapse bringing down so many players with it has now cleared the path for regulators to march in with ferocity. Do you anticipate regulatory clarity and enforcement in 2 years' time?
Less than 2 years' time. I mean, you know, there's been a lot of sort of, you know, dry powder being held for a moment like this, and I think you're going to see a lot of it. I don't think it was entirely coincidental that, you know, this CBDC experiment was launched, you know, within seemingly minutes of this meltdown. Yeah. I don't think that was coincidental, and I think, you know, regulators have wind in their sails right now. Now. Will that lead to clarity? It depends on one's definition of clarity. You know, there's still a lot of work to be done on taxonomy. You know, if you engage with most of the regulators, you know, at a really granular level, you know, what are all these different assets? Can you define and build regulatory framework around these different types of assets? They're not really rulemaking. You know, it still is, for the moment, a lot of, regulation by enforcement. And so you know, it may become more clear that you're going to be more restricted, but that doesn't mean that it becomes more clear, you know, to players in the market. This is what I know that I can do, particularly on the crypto side. I'm not sure that we're going to see a lot of that, you know, really coherent rulemaking. But I think we will see a lot more, you know, regulation, broad brush strokes, and much more enforcement. Okay.
You mentioned CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. And I have to say that this idea of, well, it's no coincidence that we've seen this collapse of FTX and there's so many members, so many players in the crypto industry, and right at the same time, you know, the New York Fed launches a pilot program for its CBDC. Chris, do you think that there could be other forces at play here?
So I think that the CBDC momentum has existed for quite some time. So I don't think it's really new or recent, or that we should be that concerned about the fact that the timing immediately followed this collapse. I do think that the collapse of Terra and the token, kind of the token taking down that started all of this, Terra and Luna, that collapse caused many of the things that were just going to be CBDC or government-led stablecoin experiments got some form then, as people thought that maybe there would be a greater definition, stablecoin legislation, some form of regulation that requires people who are doing centralized finance rather than decentralized finance to behave like centralized financiers. And so I do think that there's an interesting, and I don't like the idea of an institutional garden trapping all of this either, but there is some risk that the CBDC activity traps and ends innovation around private stablecoins. I think there's a lot of momentum behind the larger existing stablecoins to try to get sensible regulation that allows them to coexist with CBDCs. I hope that that's successful in not only creating an establishment of private stablecoins, but allowing other new stablecoins to be created and advanced and designed. But it's certainly the case that both the recent FTX problems as well as the problems that led to that, Three Arrows Capital and others, are driving additional regulatory activity, and I think that's going to include more CBDC experiments like the one we're seeing from the New York Fed.
And certainly stable coins have been in the crosshairs of Janet Yellen. She has highlighted stable coins in particular because it is probably the biggest threat to fiat currency, central bank fiat currency. So let's fast forward 8 to 10 years' time. And we'll start off with the conversation of central bank digital currencies. At the moment, we have 19 of the G20 members actively working on CBDCs. According to the Atlantic Council, 105 countries are in some form of exploration, testing of central bank digital currencies. So Patrick, firstly, why don't we start with a definition of what a CBDC is for those in our audience that may not know? And tell me where you think will be, from that perspective, in the next 8 years.
Yeah, so, you know, and actually CBDC is sort of a blanket term that, you know, covers a couple of different areas. So we can talk about a sort of a wholesale CBDC, you know, say an interbank payment system. But I think most of the attention right now is focused around a retail CBDC where, and there are a couple of different flavors, right? One flavor is where individuals have a direct account with the central bank. You know, there's another flavor in which you maintain that sort of two-tier banking system, and the CBDC is the unit that is issued, you know, by the private sector banks and also used wholesale. So there's a couple of different flavors of that. You know, I think that you know, most of the controversy, I don't think anyone's really fussed about a new interbank payment system, and there's some question about whether it's even needed in the U.S. We see a lot of that stuff happening, and I don't find that particularly controversial. Most of the controversy is around the retail version of it. One, because, you know, it's basically, it is sort of a governmental takeover of payment systems and payments innovation, so I think that's part of it. I think the most kind of, what gives me the biggest pause is the programmability. Mm-hmm. You know, and you know, we're in this space. You know, we build a lot of this technology, and I say to my colleagues all the time, when you're a technologist, you don't have the luxury of assuming that the things that you develop are going to always be used for good. You have to anticipate, you know, the things that it can be used for. And I think everybody here knows that blockchain can be, you know, one of the greatest regulatory tools, but also one of the greatest surveillance tools. And the programmability of money, you know, really puts a lot of power in the hands of not just regulators and not just central banks, but even policymakers. You know, at a very you know, fine level, and so that's where a lot of that controversy, you know, comes in. Sorry, go ahead.
But in its current form, it's essentially being conceived as still a fiat currency, still not backed by anything. In the programs that we're hearing about, I'm going to put the BRIC nations aside for a minute, but for the most part, people are looking at this as central bank, a different form of digital fiat currency. And Chris, the concern is, as Patrick points out, is that this will obliterate any kind of privacy, that the government will be able to know every single transaction you make, when you make it, how you make it. If these tokens or coins are programmed, then the government can take you out of the system. And when you bring that, and I'm painting the nightmare scenario here, but when you bring that into the conversation with, say, the ESG movement, for example, this idea of climate change and decarbonization, the concern is, okay, Chris, you've taken 6 flights this year, you've exceeded your carbon allowance, we are now stopping you from using your central bank digital currency to make any further purchases, or maybe you'll have to pay it at a premium to make up for your carbon footprint. Or we've seen government overreach during the pandemic and saw around the world that governments were imposing curfews, limits, things that were just incomprehensible to many of us living in free societies prior to the pandemic. And that is, as Patrick points out, the big issue here: government overreach, privacy, and the ability for governments to program these coins. And then, of course, we bring in the idea of political dissidents, people that don't agree with the government. I like to point out the example of what we saw in Canada with Justin Trudeau blocking the traditional bank accounts of the truckers who were opposed getting the vaccine. Where I'm going with this, Chris, is in 8 to 10 years' time, is this a likely scenario that we could all be living in, where we have central bank digital currencies and we find our freedoms so severely curtailed?
Yeah, I think there were people yesterday who were up here talking about the problem of deplatforming based on holding ideas that are no longer considered mainstream. And I think that the extent of deplatforming and other things that we've seen has now reached into payments. And I think that there's a risk that if there is a centralized bank digital currency, a central bank digital currency, that it will be used for that as well. I think that's just an obvious risk of it, I think.
To be canceled, as we say.
To allow people to be canceled at a greater scale than cancellation occurs now. And so I think we need to think about that. But I think we also need to think about some of the even more fundamental things that you started to talk about as you talked about the integration with ESG. And one of the ways in which I've talked with people about this is, imagine that the dollars, the actual physical dollars that you're carrying around, had in them some magic controls that when you tried to spend them on particular things, they just wouldn't spend. They would get stuck to your hand, and you couldn't use them to spend them on particular things. Or imagine that your cost, they could be programmed so that when you spent them on a particular thing, they were only worth 50 cents. But when someone else spent them on a particular thing, they were worth $1. Or imagine that they could just disappear from your hand. And those are all the things that can be done if you have a programmable central bank digital currency. And so we need to be concerned about those. And if we are going to have a dialogue about what a healthy central bank digital currency looks like, we need to include our First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, and other rights in that conversation.
Well, let's hope that it doesn't go that route, and let's hope that values and principles in the Constitution are indeed upheld, at least in the United States. But putting CBDCs aside, as I say, 8 to 10 years' time, where is traditional finance? Are we all interacting via DeFi, Patrick? Is there even a potential scenario where I don't have my keys in my ledger or my Trezor, but I have a little chip underneath my skin? That way I can't lose it, right? I mean, it's already in existence now. People do have chips under their skin in office places in Holland, I believe. So paint me a picture of what the financial system looks like in 8 to 10 years' time, and where traditional finance is with regards to decentralized finance.
Sure. So I don't think that I'm particularly qualified to talk about whether we'll all be chipped at some point, and I share I share your concerns, and I completely share the warnings that you put out there about CBDC. These are all really important things. Where is finance? So this is interesting because we're smack in the middle of these discussions. We work with some of the biggest, custodial banks in the world. Is custody going to be a thing when all assets are tokenized, for example? It's a good question, and I can tell you it's a question that we have directly with the banks. Because there are things that you can do with tokenized assets in terms of securing them that don't require traditional custody. I do think that those banks will remain relevant, but I think that what they'll be doing is finding, and again, just as you say, leveraging DeFi to find, to give value add for the custodial services that they're providing. And in that, we're already working on a lot of these things. You can take, for example, if you tokenize collateral within a large institution, and then you apply DeFi principles, you basically have automated sec lending, and you're doing all kinds of amazing things that are basically taking what's been done in the DeFi world and transferring it over into this institutional space. That's already happening. I think clearinghouses will, flail and flop. Clearinghouses and other intermediaries that have become fixtures of the landscape will begin to fade away. We work closely with DTCC, and they're looking for ways to continue to make themselves relevant. But it's because everyone knows, and in a blockchain world, it's not relevant. There's another good question about whether centralized exchanges will survive this transition. And there are a couple of different schools of thought. One is that maybe they'll be subsumed or overcome by DeFi. Others that they'll still perform a pricing role as nodes in a larger network. I think some of that has yet to be played out, and to a certain extent, I would say, in my observation, is it really depends on the extent to which and the way in which these institutions embrace the new technology. They're all talking, everyone knows that things are going to be tokenized, everyone knows that DeFi is a thing.
Can you break down the tokenized concept for us?
Sure,
for those in the audience that aren't quite familiar with what you mean, that everything will be tokenized and the traditional institutions will have to get on board with that. If we can just simplify that concept.
Yeah, so I mean, effectively, tokenization is simply, representing an asset as a line on a ledger, this ledger being a distributed ledger, right? That's effectively what it is. And when we add in the programmability piece, right? So one of the things that we work on is the automation of pre-trade compliance, for example. And that has incredible implications for, clearing and settlement, instant DVP, particularly when you have a digital asset on the other side, digital payment on the other side. So tokenization is just taking what you would think of as say a security, represented as either a ledger entry, a DTCC, or a paper certificate, and now it's represented on a distributed ledger. Now, again, there are what we would call natively digital tokens, where that token is the security, that token is the asset. And then there are others where that token is a representation of the asset, which lives somewhere else. That's what we're talking about with tokenization. And the key to that, the reason that people say, well, why does it matter? Why do we want to tokenize anything? And the reason is because with the automation, with the tokenization, with a single settlement layer, you can do things and really attract a whole lot more liquidity for these assets than you can in the traditional world.
Okay, and again, tokenization can be substituted with NFT, non-fungible token, sort of using the two terms interchangeably there. Chris, on the upside, perhaps to Patrick's point, because the traditional finance may be threatened by central bank digital currencies, because it may, people say, eliminate the middleman, perhaps that could sort of weigh in on the process here and hamper some of the more excessive overreach and progress. Where do you see us in 8 to 10 years' time? Is it a similar vision to Patrick's?
It's similar, but I would highlight the aspect that you just highlighted, and thank you for throwing that softball up so slowly so I could hit it. The next 2 to 5 years are going to be a huge battle between traditional finance and the new finance over how these things will change. Because one of the things that existing players have is they have a regulatory architecture in which they've been operating for, say, 30 plus years. And within that architecture, as an example, we don't have a model of a centralized securities clearinghouse that's not an entity that's regulated. So a totally distributed model in which a securities clearinghouse like the one Patrick just described is operating entirely on a blockchain doesn't really exist. The regulators want someone and something to regulate. And so there will be a regulatory conversation about, can we create an entity that really is just the operator of a blockchain, and the blockchain's doing all the work of moving these assets around, and we're regulating that blockchain? Or will these centralized operators like DTCC maintain their positioning by saying, no, you regulate us, so we are the only ones who can create these blockchains that will be used in this particular regulatory way? And I think that battle's already started and is going to continue to play out over the next 2 to 5 years.
Do you mind if I jump in? Because it's really interesting. And because you've hit on something that's really important, and I think, obviously many in the audience already know this, but for those who don't, I mean, the key is, this is a complete paradigmatic shift. You were actually asking about why tokenize. And we use this expression, we've all come up in a world in which these assets live in systems. So I have an asset that's in, Boney system, or it's in State Street system, or it's here. This is a world in which the system lives in the asset. And the asset is programmed, it knows exactly what it can or cannot do. And so things that used to take 5 or 6 intermediaries are all kind of merged into one. Here's a simple example, right? When you execute a trade, for example, a tokenized security for a digital payment, you're actually performing the record keeping, the clearing and settlement, the pre-trade compliance, all as one activity. But your point is a very good one, that doesn't mean that the regulators are going to say, well, I guess nobody's responsible, or, hey, you're responsible for all of it. They're still going to bifurcate all of those responsibilities and say, well, okay, you're responsible for the clearing portion of it, right? And you're responsible for, the issuer's responsible for the pre-trade compliance. And so it's going to get funky in the way that, you kind of split that up because it's all happening automated.
Okay, Chris, paint me a picture though. How do I buy a burger in the next 8 to 10 years? How am I transacting there?
So this is where there's another area of innovation that we haven't really talked about, and that's the fact that many platforms, including blockchain.com very recently, are adding payments networks on top of crypto wallets and crypto holdings. And I think that is going to be extended to other asset classes, that's going to be extended to other kinds of tokenized assets, where when you go to pay, whether it's with your phone or a swipe or your thumb or in some other way, when you go to pay for something, the payment will be taken from an asset that will be made liquid just at the moment that you need to pay. So rather than storing all of your wealth in depreciating currencies, you will be storing your wealth in assets, and just at the moment you need to use it, it will be traded token for token for cash equivalent, and then that cash equivalent will be delivered to the vendor that you're buying something from. And I think that is the future of a lot of things, because that is a way to increase significantly what people will perceive as their disposable income or their income, appreciate it significantly with no cost. No cost other than all of this systemic change that's occurring.
It's spot on, Chris. And we're doing that actually today. We're doing this with one of our partners, Wisdom Tree, and it's a neo-banking concept. It's why do I have my money in a savings account when I can hold it in a floating rate treasury and I can liquidate it at the point of sale? It's exactly right. Why do I have my money in a checking account when I can have a stable coin and I've got my digital cash, right? So you're exactly right. It's happening today, and I think it'll just accelerate.
Well, you touched on depreciating currencies, and that sort of brings us to a more macro conversation here. So let's say it's exactly 14 years from when Satoshi wrote the white paper, and by my math, that is 2036. Yes, I think so. I haven't had my coffee yet this morning, but I still think I'm correct.
I think that's right.
Except for the one in the room. It's not as punching.
That was strong.
But 2036. We're having conversations now that with inflation, we're seeing the dollar devalued and debased after the unprecedented fiscal and monetary stimulus. On the global stage, a lot of faith has been lost in the dollar, and there's a question whether the dollar will maintain its supremacy as the sole global reserve currency. I mentioned the BRICS earlier with regards to central bank digital currencies. They're in conversations that they don't need to use the dollar or the SWIFT system to transact, especially in light of how the dollar has been weaponized during this conflict now between Russia and Ukraine. The BRICS are reportedly looking at a central bank digital currency backed by a commodity or a basket of commodities, potentially even gold, because Russia is launching its own gold standard, the Moscow gold standard, to compete with the LBMA. There is this collusion happening with certain countries in the world which may lead to the bifurcation of the global monetary system. For a number of reasons, they are quite fed up with the US dollar having this position of dominance and having their debt denominated in dollars, which then increases as the US government prints and prints and prints, or clicks and clicks and clicks, as the case may be. So one of the solutions has been proposed or suggested is this idea of a Bitcoin standard, to have something to have currencies pegged to. 2036, a reality, an idea completely far off.
Basket-based asset pools underlying a new form of global reserve will be a reality by that time, I believe. Those conversations have been going on a long time. The dollar has been declining year over year as a percentage of all reserves. And if any other country had printed $10 trillion at one time, or over the short period of time that we have, their currency would be completely debased. The only thing holding up the dollar is the fact that we made a really great deal at Bretton Woods and beyond to make the dollar the global reserve currency. And if it wasn't, if transactions weren't required to be in dollars, if we weren't able to borrow in the currency in which we can print to repay it, we would be in even more trouble than we're already in. And I think we're already in that trouble. I think that trouble is going to manifest over a period of time that's relatively short. And by 2036, I think we will see a significant increase in other currencies and other baskets of commodities underlying people's and countries' reserves.
Before I get to you, Patrick, because I do see you nodding in agreement, but do you see Bitcoin playing a role in that for some central banks?
Not yet. Not yet. So one of the things that Mark Yusko called out yesterday is that the bumps in Bitcoin get really small when you look at them through a different time horizon. I don't think that time horizon is yet long enough for people to rely on Bitcoin as a stable store of value at the level of stability that they will want in order to use it to replace the dollar.
At what point in time do you see the Bitcoin being used as a global standard or as a store of value by central banks? And I'm asking you to look into your crystal ball here, granted.
Yes. If I had Aladdin's lamp, I would rub it and ask the genie. The future of storage, it's still unclear that Bitcoin will be it. And I think we're going to see competitive pressure from CBDCs. We're going to see competitive pressure from, existing things that people are used to using to underlie value, like gold or other metals. And I think we're going to see pressure from other things that already have a history of stability before digital currencies. So I don't know. That crystal ball is too cloudy for me to say. I wish I could prognosticate for you, but that crystal ball is too cloudy for me to say whether Bitcoin will survive.
But you do seem pretty confident in the answer that we'll see, at the very least, a split in the global monetary system, and the dollar status will be threatened.
I think we made that inevitable when we seized Russia's dollar-denominated assets, full stop, en masse, during the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I think we made that inevitable. I think we surprised certain players that we were willing to do that, and I think that undermined their long-term trust in holding assets in dollars.
All right, yeah, weaponizing the dollar. Patrick, do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, with almost all of it. I mean, look at what's going on. The World Economic Forum announced that in January at their Davos meeting, they're going to conduct a monetary reset simulation. Okay, scary. Okay, again, if we prognosticate, one can imagine a world in which you can see this as sort of a looming sort of financial Cold War with these two sides sort of. You have the BRICS on one side, and let's call it sort of the NATO nations on the other side. We saw in El Salvador with Bukele this desire for kind of a third rail that might be Bitcoin, but they're up against some pretty powerful forces. I mean, they certainly the G20, the IMF closed ranks very quickly against that proposition. We've seen. Even, for example, there are companies that are engaged right now that we speak with. We're not working with them in particular, but that are dealing with let's call them third world governments, and saying, I can create for you a metals-backed, and a basket of metals, a metals-backed currency, so you can get out from under either the US or China. Because China's DCEP is connected with its entire, One Belt, One Road policy, and even the blockchain services network, and, we kind of know where that leads. So I think a lot of that experimentation is actually beginning to happen, but I don't think that that's where, say, the EU and the US, at least not the folks who are currently, running things, there. I don't think that's where they're going. I don't think they're looking at Bitcoin as, they're looking at preserving the power of the dollar for the US, certainly. But I'm completely with you. I mean, I think that, that moment is passing. And that doesn't happen without a great deal of chaos and disruption.
Does Bitcoin play a role for the individual then, in the midst of this chaos and disruption, as the World Economic Forum, as you say, is looking for this global reset? Does that perhaps build the case for individuals to be using Bitcoin and trying to create an alternative system, as was initially conceived by Satoshi as a peer-to-peer payment system, Chris? Oh, Patrick, you're about to answer. Go for it.
I was going to say, I mean, philosophically, I think so, and I hope so. But again, that doesn't happen without an awful lot of messiness. These are, and I think that, part of what you see, I say this all the time, you see a lot of regulation that is actually fronting for policy making. They'll tell you that it's AML, KYC, but really there's some other underlying policy, whether it's propping up CBDC or something else. And I think it is that fear among a lot of policymakers that this is a bolt hole for individuals that they really want to close off. So it could happen, but it won't happen, I think, without a lot of messiness, as I said before.
And I agree with Patrick that it will be very messy as if people transition away from dollars and towards other assets, including Bitcoin. I think for an individual right now, given the recent volatility of Bitcoin and the uncertainty about where things will go given the recent unpleasantness, I'm not sure anyone would make that choice or would wisely make that choice. But there will be a need during this, what will be a very difficult time during this transition away from the dollar as the global reserve currency. There'll be some difficulties, and in those difficulties, I think people will move their assets out of even the dollar, the same way they're currently doing with non-dollar weak currencies. People will move them into other assets in relatively large for an individual scale.
When we say dollar, we're talking about the digital dollar in 2036. What is the likelihood that those pieces of paper in my wallet are still being used in 2036? Will we have a paper cashless society?
I don't envision cashlessness yet. I think that there will be a view, there will be an even more disruptive view if we end cash entirely and paper cash and everything's digital. I do think, though, we've already gone there a lot. All of those risks I talked about, the risk that a dollar will be snatched out of your hand, not the risk that it'll change value in the middle of a transaction, but the ability to take dollars is already very high due to the massive electronification of what we think of as our interactions in cash. Most of us don't store our cash in a mattress. We're storing it in a digital form at a bank, and then we're using it at a digital form on a card.
But we have the option.
And that's just it.
We have the option, and we have the anonymity, and we have the option in the case of power failures, no internet, no Wi-Fi, we still can pull out that wad of cash.
And some people still do, right? Some people still keep a smaller cash reserve for exactly that purpose. That's why I think the government won't take it entirely away. I do think they know that enough people think about the option of cash as a safety or a security of some kind, and they won't take it away.
Patrick, very quickly, do you think we'll still have cash in 2036?
No.
Wow. And we're out of time. But I'm going to let you finish that thought.
Everyone, go ahead.
Just as we got to the good part. No, go ahead, go ahead. I'm looking at Matt. I think he's giving me a nod that I can continue for a little longer here.
You know,
It's red, but it's not blinking yet, so.
The lasers aren't shooting out. So no, I mean, look, we're talking about right now, like I said, you know, the World Economic Forum is talking about a monetary, you know, reset simulation. You know, this is, I don't, look, call it a conspiracy theory, whatever. This, you know, multi-trillion-dollar stimulus stuff. This was, you know, MMT on steroids. Mm-hmm. It's completely, you wouldn't do this rationally unless it was kind of the, you know, the final act, you know, of a play, and there's a new show coming. That's how I think about it. So,
Patrick, to your defense, there are a number of theorists out there, we can call them conspiracy theorists, if you will, that say that this was all engineered, perhaps even including the pandemic, in order to create this reset of the financial system. So it's not such a far-out concept in the sense that a lot of people do gravitate towards that idea. But so you think we're going to have no cash 2036, and you're painting a pretty bleak picture of the world.
Can I explain why, though? I mean, if you look at China, and China's already done it.
Yeah.
And you know, the difference, so people in the West go, oh, well, there's some really useful things we can learn there, but we're not as bad as them, so we'll do it better. I don't think so. I think that, you know, power corrupts, right? And so in the end, you know, what is social credit scoring in China? Take a CBDC and apply ESG, and you have the same thing in the West. You know, you know, that's how I see this all playing out. And, you know, you referred earlier to the truckers in Canada. We've seen what's happened in the Netherlands with the farmers. You know, the thing is that we're like frogs in slowly boiling water. It's happening around us. And no one is actually hiding it. They're saying it. This is what we're doing, you know. So I don't think anyone should be surprised when it happens. I won't be, but I think it is going to happen.
All right, well, we'll try to end on a positive note then. What can we do about it?
I'm slightly more hopeful. I'm slightly more hopeful that we will have these fights. I think these are going to be fights. I think they are going to occur out in the open. And this is why people of goodwill who are Catholic need to be engaged in this dialogue, because we will be fighting for an incredible portfolio of rights that we could lose if all of this goes the wrong direction. So stand up and be counted.
Listen, no one is more hopeful than me. We know how this ends, right? so I'm not conflicted on that. What I am saying, though, is, you know, for human beings, you know, prayer is a strategy, but blind hope is not a strategy, right? And we hope it'll all work out all right. But you're right. We have to do something about it. We have to actually be the first step is to be conscious of it, right? Yes. And again, you know, you don't have to take this sort of bleak apocalyptic view that, oh, they're just like these demonic forces, you know. They certainly there are demonic forces, but a lot of the people who are behind this really believe that they're doing this for good reason. I mean, you know, how many people, you know, we talk about FTX, said, hey, effective altruism, that sounds like a really good idea. Except in practice, right? You know? And so, you know, I think that there are a lot of people who embrace these things and have really good intentions, but don't actually play it out to its logical end. And when you look at, again, FTX, remove the temptation, right? You got a brokerage, you got an exchange. That's always going to go wrong, even if you have noble intentions, even if you have the, you know, the purest of intentions. I'm going to operate this clean and I'm going to distribute it to charity. No, it goes wrong because power corrupts, right? So we have to be conscious of it. I'm not without hope, believe me.
Okay, so we have to be conscious very quickly because we do need to wrap it. I would like to try and end on some kind of positive spin here. Chris, what can we do then?
So what can we do? We can start by becoming aware, right? All of these things are happening now. These will have ends in this future, in this 2 to 10 year time frame. These will come to an end. All of these conversations are beginning now. So enter into this dialogue, enter into it into your communities, enter into it with your political, legislative, and regulatory contacts. have these conversations and participate. Be heard. Express your opinion that freedom is important. Express your opinion that the digitization of everything is not necessarily a good idea. Express your views and bring your educated view to the dialogue, because this conversation is happening right now. And now's the best time. Yesterday was actually the best time to start talking about this. Today's the second best time. So talk, begin now.
All right, Patrick, final thoughts. Make them happy, please.
I actually can't build too much on that. That was a fantastic summation. And look, again, pray, right? Be engaged, be aware, get involved. And again, speaking the truth should not be deemed a conspiracy theory, right? And don't get trapped in that fear of, hey, this doesn't look right, That's okay. Sometimes a tinfoil hat fits me just fine, so.
All right, well, we'll get you one. But you know what, but I believe the saying is a conspiracy theorist is just someone that finds out what other people will know ahead of them. That's a very poorly misquoted version of that, but something to that effect. All right, well, thank you so much. It's been an insightful and slightly depressing conversation, but it's important to know. So thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.